No, we're not a bunch of homophobic weirdos. Guys would much rather just watch a movie like Rambo. So, if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, I'll explain. Now, this is definitely an original video. I guarantee you there's nothing else like it on YouTube. So, give me a thumbs up for originality if you don't mind supporting the channel. So anyway, if you don't know what I'm referencing or talking about, I'll explain. The first gay romantic comedy was released over this past weekend, and quite frankly, it bombed. So the writer and star of the film, Billy Eichner, has said that he's disappointed that straight people didn't show up for his new movie, Bros. In this video, I'll tell you the real reason why nobody showed up, and it has nothing to do with being homophobic. Also, make sure to stay until the end because I will tell you why a movie like Rambo 2 is so great, and if studios would make more films like that, guys would actually show up to the theater for non-comic book related films.
It's a part of our past. It reminds us of all that once was good, and it could be again.
As far as why no one showed up for Bros, well, first of all, it's hard to get anyone in the theater post-pandemic. For example, in September, the domestic box office was down 54% compared with September of 2019. Second, straight guys just don't care about romantic comedies and only go to the theater to watch those if forced by their wives or girlfriends. I mean, let's be real. You think after a pickup basketball game a bunch of guys are going to say, hey, let's all continue to hang out and watch that new romantic comedy with Julia Roberts? It ain't gonna happen. Now with Bros being a gay romantic comedy, that's beyond a tall order. Especially if guys aren't even going to go to a hetero romantic comedy starring a hot chick they'd actually fantasize about. So a bunch of straight dudes are more likely to show up at a Melissa Etheridge concert than go into the movie like Bros. And it has nothing to do with being homophobic. There's just no interest. Third, and this is taking the line out of Field of Dreams, well, you have to build something people actually want. And then yes, they will come. They will show up.
People will most definitely come.
I think there was a pretty successful formula back in the 80s and 90s that got a lot of interest. We'd much rather see a guy jump up in the air, do the splits, and kick a dude smoking a cigar in the face.
So rip up the shirt.
And that's after he's already surfed on top of a motorcycle and punched a rattlesnake. That's way more interesting than watching two guys kiss. Or how about putting an explosive tip on an arrow and blowing up a truck? That's way more appealing than watching elementary kids joking, dancing, and celebrating gay butt sex.
Gay sex was more fun when straight people were uncomfortable with it.
I had an idea of what the dad bottom meant, but I had to look it up just to be sure. And sure enough, it refers to a male who usually has anal in gay sex.
Bottom dick! Bottom dick!
I mean, I can't blame a major theater chain for wanting to pull the trailer for Bros. Billy Eichner had tweeted and said, at one point, a theater chain called Universal and said they were pulling the trailer because of gay content. Universal convinced them not to. America, fuck yeah. So this is what America has become? The land of let's teach all our elementary age school children about the joys of gay butt sex? Kids this age should not be subjected to and exposed to any sexual acts whatsoever. Not heterosexual, not gay, etc. How about learning math and learning how to read and write instead? That's much better for young children. And for the record, I don't really care if somebody's gay. Like, I really don't. And I think most people my age, and especially younger, are just indifferent. Like, we don't really care.
I mean, it's fine if that's who you are.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have many gay friends.
My father's gay.
So a lot of us in general are just indifferent, which brings me to another point. Billy Eichner encourages everyone who isn't a homophobic weirdo to watch Bros. That's a fine line from straight up calling anybody who doesn't watch that stupid movie homophobic.
And if we don't do this, we're letting the heterosexual terrorists win.
If it makes Billy feel any better, a lot of straight people don't show up for plenty of other movies either. But instead of accepting the blame for making something that is just not going to appeal to a wide audience, he immediately shifts the blame onto the very people the trailer alienated. Billy Eichner, a true professional victim, wants to further marginalize the people he's trying to represent. He wants them to feel unaccepted by mainstream society at large. He doesn't seem to realize that people are allowed to feel indifferent about a subject and only be interested in the kinds of films they feel they would actually enjoy watching. It has nothing to do with being homophobic. The movie Bros is just a hard sell on so many levels. On a broader scope, it's a comedy. But none of the jokes we've been shown in the trailer actually appeal to a universal audience.
And no one has acknowledged it!
Instead, they're in-jokes that the gay audience would understand and appreciate way more than any other group, which is fine because in many ways the movie was made for that audience.
It was on purpose. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
But what is wrong is for him to expect a much broader audience to be interested in the film. Go to the theater, watch it, and then when they don't, complain and try to imply people are homophobic. The fact of the matter is the film cost about $22 million to make. Universal spent $30 to $40 million to promote it and put it on 3,350 screens.
Are you nuts?
It sold 4.8 million in tickets, which was about 40% less than expected. That suggests outright marketplace rejection. It also goes to show that celebrity influencers don't have as much power as one may think. For example, going into the weekend, stars like Chris Evans, Seth Rogen, and Mariah Carey pleaded with people on Twitter to buy tickets for Bros. That's not a proper way to sell an audience on a movie or anything for that matter. That's like going to a car dealership and the salesman pleading with you to buy a car. It doesn't work that way. They have to sell you on what it's actually going to provide you. For example, BMW markets itself as the ultimate driving experience. So if taking a test drive you realize that it's quite a bit better than the other cars you've driven, you might actually buy it because it's giving you, the individual, what you may actually care about, the ultimate driving experience. You're certainly not going to consider buying it because the salesman pleads with you.
I'm begging you, please! Come on, please!
I guess Universal could have tried to market Bros as the funniest movie in years and show more jokes in the trailer that have universal appeal so the other audience, non-gay, might actually be interested. But just going back to the subgenre of romantic comedy, these have all struggled in recent years, gay or not. The genre now mostly lives on streaming services. Studios have released 40 rom-coms in theaters over the last decade. That's only 4 per year, compared to 212 during the 15 years prior to that, which were 14 per year. The audience clearly has lost interest. Now, let's talk about movies that do have clear and continued interest. When I referenced Hard Target and Rambo First Blood Part 2 earlier, I was merely giving examples on some action sequences. Now, obviously, that's never enough. The audience needs and craves more whether they realize it or not. And I'll tell you why. Those movies are only memorable partly due to the action. There are so many action movies that are easily forgettable and not successful. A lot of those films never found success when they were released, haven't found success since, and never will. Now in the case of Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Hard Target, they're still revered today, 30 years later. And when it comes to these movies in general, I think a lot of people try to diminish them in some way by calling them, quote, dumb action movies where you can just turn your brain off and be entertained by them. Don't get me wrong, there are quite a few in this genre that are not memorable and that are otherwise dumb. In the case of Rambo First Blood Part 2, whether you turn your brains off or not while watching it, which would be doing it and you a disservice by the way, it still does work on a subconscious level, which is why we like, love, and remember it. It's not hard to wonder why the film was initially so successful upon its release. In fact, it was the second highest grossing film in 1985, only making less than Back to the Future that year. Funny enough, those two films share something in common. They both deal heavily with correcting a mistake made in the past.
Do we get to win this time?
Which is something that really appeals to an audience on a universal level, so it should be no surprise that both these films are so popular. Rambo 2, of course, had a big advantage out of the gate due to Stallone's star power at the time, and also the fact that it was a sequel to First Blood, which was quite successful years prior and already had a built-in audience.
Sylvester Stallone is back as Rambo.
But why is it still so popular well over 30 years later? Well, it had amazing production values, even earning an Oscar nomination for Best Sound Design. But that's not the reason it stood the test of time. Instead, it really managed to connect with the audience, which is what all great films must do if they're to be remembered. When an audience connects to a character, Rambo in this case, everything that character experiences becomes much more emotional and the audience can connect with the character. The film is also cathartic in many ways, both directly targeted towards a very specific group, but also broadly targeted to many others. Direct in relation to the soldiers who actually fought in Vietnam and their brothers that were left behind. Rambo 2 in many ways can be thought of as a fantasy, in the sense that it's a film full of hope, which for many people is a great draw in itself. Hope is what keeps us moving forward in the face of adversity. For many of us, real life in many ways didn't quite pan out the way we wanted it to.
Maybe go America. Live the quiet life.
And in the case of Rambo, and furthermore the Vietnam conflict in real life, things surely didn't pan out the way anyone wanted. The fact that soldiers were left behind and more or less forgotten about by the government didn't sit too well with anyone, rightfully so. So when Rambo gets a chance to, quote, win this time, we're instantly on board with them and actually care about the mission. And while many of us never personally served ourselves in the military, guys can still strongly relate to a brotherhood, whether it's through their experiences and participation on different sports teams whilst growing up, or the group of guys they've hung out with and played poker with on Saturday nights, for example. Many of us, at least at some point in our lives, felt we were part of a group, and there's a certain level of loyalty and honor you have towards that group, where you have their back, so to speak, which is why we can relate to Rambo when he has to rescue the POW he finds, as opposed to simply doing what he's instructed, merely taking photos. Now, brotherhood aside, it works on the opposite level as well, which is another thing we can all identify with and have likely experienced ourselves. The whole scene where Rambo talks about being expendable. Many of us have felt like that at certain points in our lives. An outsider, an outcast.
It's like if someone invites you to a party and you don't show up. It doesn't really matter.
In order for something cathartic to work in film, it often has to reflect our own experiences. That way, it allows us to connect to the art and the artist on a deeper level. In the case of Rambo, in which Stallone in many ways is a one-man army, it says that it's okay to be an outcast, that each of us individually can still make a difference. Of course, movies are dramatized and exaggerated because obviously we're not going to single-handedly go into a war zone, rescue POWs, and fly them out on a helicopter. That's not the point. The point is that film can help shape how we see the world, and I do believe each of us individually can make a difference in some way. Films like Rambo 2 help reinforce that. These are stories at their very core, stories about humans, their emotions, their challenges, victories, defeats, flaws, and of course, courage. Now, for something cathartic to truly work in film, emotion has to build up over time, and when there's enough pressure built, it needs to be released in an explosive and memorable way in order to hit an emotional peak the audience will remember. In the case of Rambo, it really comes down to doing and fighting for what's right. The character needs to bring his forgotten brothers back home, which helps give him some sort of closure from the events that transpired even prior to First Blood. By the end of the film, the world for Rambo is now, at the very least, sort of back in balance. He set what he needed to in motion.
You know there's more men out there. Find them, or I'll find you.
Leaving the rest off to Murdoch and the politicians to do the right thing. Of course they won't.
Come on, man!
But for Rambo, he was still able to make some sort of impact, even if for just a handful of individuals. And again, deep down, we realize we don't have the power to individually change the world per se with our actions, but we too can at least do our part, and in doing so, make some sort of a dent. So that's why we remember films like Rambo 2 and how we connect with it, and we realize that going on the journey with Rambo was actually worthwhile because we too got something out of it, just like the character himself. But what's the takeaway from movies like Bros?
Gay sex was more fun when straight people were uncomfortable with it.